Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The event we're analyzing today is the worst man-made ecological disaster of the 20th century, the Dust Bowl. What do we mean when we say the Dust Bowl? It was an area that suffered severe drought in the 1930s. Geographically, it's the southwestern part of the Great Plains region of the United States. It was a territory covering parts of 5 states: the Oklahoma Panhandle, the northern 2/3 of the Texas Panhandle, the western third of Kansas, southeastern Colorado, and northeastern New Mexico. Prior to humans altering the landscape, it was a semi-arid grassland, a treeless plain. So what caused this disaster? Well, we have to go back to the American Civil War. In the mid-1800s, there were a lot of policies which Northerners proposed that would help develop the United States. The problem was that Southerners blocked all of these policies. They did not want the country to progress commercially or educationally. They wanted to keep their agricultural way of life, which, of course, was based upon slavery. During the Civil War, when 11 states had seceded from the Union, politicians from the North were able to pass the following landmark laws that changed the country. 1. The Pacific Railway Act was passed in 1862. That provided for federal government support for building the first transcontinental railroad. Once completed, the Transcontinental Railroad truly unified the country. 2. Also passed in 1862 was the Morill Land Grant College Act. Under that law, the federal government granted states 30,000 acres for the construction of agricultural and mechanical schools. This led to the founding or transformation of so many colleges which exist today, including University of Connecticut, University of Illinois, Purdue, Iowa State, Kansas State, University of Kentucky, LSU, University of Maryland, UMass, Michigan State, University of Missouri, Mississippi State, University of Nebraska, University of Nevada, Rutgers, North Carolina State, Ohio State, Oklahoma State, Oregon State, Penn State, and a lot of others. The third important act passed in 1862 was the Homestead Act, and that's what brings us to our subject today. This law gave 160 acres of federal land to anybody who agreed to farm that land. The only requirement was that the settlers had to reside on the land continuously for 5 years. The Homestead Act distributed millions of acres of western land to individual settlers. By 1890, the federal government had granted 373,000 homesteads on approximately 48 million acres of previously undeveloped land. This was a great opportunity not only for Americans, but for so many immigrants who were pouring into the United States at that time. People who had never owned anything could now own land. Before somebody points it out, of course this land had been stolen from the Native Americans. I'm not diminishing that tragedy. I'm just saying that by this point in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the federal government had already taken this land from the Native Americans, and they were not giving it back. At least, with the Homestead Act of 1862 and the subsequent amendments to that law, a lot of poor people who never had a chance now had a path for upward mobility. Eventually, more than 270 million acres of public land had been distributed to homesteaders. That is an enormous figure. 270 million acres is equal to about 421,000 square miles. That amounts to almost 11% of the total land area of the United States, and I'm including Alaska in that. As more and more people wanted to claim their own homesteads, settlers expanded into acreage which was considered marginal farmland at best. Prior to World War I, the southern Great Plains, the area that eventually became the Dust Bowl, was very sparsely populated. Oklahoma did not become a state until 1907, and New Mexico did not become a state until 1912. And even the older states of the Dust Bowl area, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, those parts of those states which turned into the Dust Bowl also had very few inhabitants. Before I go further, let's talk about the name. The Dust Bowl was going on for several years before it got its name. In 1935, an AP reporter named Robert Geiger described the area as a dust bowl, and the name stuck. So what caused the Dust Bowl, and why is it considered a man-made catastrophe? In World War I, American farmers were making a lot of money. This was because the Germans blockaded Russian wheat from being sold to the Western Allies. So Britain and France really needed American crops. Farmers expanded into the southern plains and cultivated a lot of areas that had never been farmed before. They were making a lot of money selling wheat to Europe. World War I went from 1914 to 1918. But when the war ended, the demand for all these crop exports greatly declined. This led to a drop in crop prices. If farmers were not going to be able to make as much money per bushel, then they would have to sell more bushels of their crops to keep up their income. So, in the 1920s, this led to farmers cultivating more and more submarginal lands. Also, in their attempt to expand their acreage under cultivation, farmers started to abandon soil conservation practices. They didn't want to take the effort for soil conservation when they needed to cultivate as much land as possible to make up for their lost income. This whole problem was exacerbated when the stock market crashed in October 1929. After that, the price for agricultural products completely collapsed. This included wheat, which was being produced in the southern Great Plains. To try to keep their families afloat, farmers plowed more and more land to grow more wheat. Of course, this created a vicious cycle. With more wheat on the market, the price continued to decline. All right, so we've outlined one of the problems, which was overproduction, which led to the cultivation of marginal lands. But the main problem was that the southern Great Plains is a region not naturally suitable to farming. Rain in this area averages less than 20 inches per year. To put that into perspective, a fertile farm area like Iowa averages 38 inches of rain per year. And it's important to consider that the less than 20 inches of rain per year is an average. That means there are some years when there is plenty of rain, but there are also plenty of years when there is drought. There was a reason why there were no trees and just grass as far as you could see on the southern plains. Buffalo grass grew well there because it had deep roots which held moisture. And most importantly, the deep roots of these prairie grasses held the soil in place. But as more and more land was cultivated for growing wheat, the prairie grass was eliminated. There was nothing holding down the soil when the winds came. And this is a very windy place. It's a flat area with essentially no trees, so there's nothing to break the fierce winds. The drought began in 1931. During the decade of the 1930s, the Dust Bowl region saw precipitation decline between 15 and 25%. Some of these counties were receiving less than 10 inches of rain per year. Experts define a desert as an area that receives no more than 10 inches of rain per year. Essentially, the Dust Bowl region was turning into a desert for the decade of the 1930s. Without rain, crops were not growing. That exposed topsoil was now laid bare. The tremendous winds of this area blew away the topsoil, raising billowing clouds of dust. You've all seen photos of the Dust Bowl. When you look at those pictures of farmhouses surrounded by sand dunes, you have to remember that a couple of years earlier, these were thriving farms with endless fields of wheat. When you look at those photos of farms during the Dust Bowl, the houses are almost completely covered with sand. These big sand dunes look like something from the Sahara Desert and not the Great Plains of the United States. I live in California. The Mojave Desert doesn't look anywhere near as bleak as those photos of the supposed farmland of the Dust Bowl. These dust storms were giant roiling clouds of dirt. In 1932, there were 14 dust storms. The next year, there were 38. They had a cumulative effect because each dust storm left more loose dirt or sand on these farms, which was then available for the next time when the winds picked up. People called these dust storms black blizzards. These storms were enormous, Some of these dust storms were many miles across. This meant there was no escaping them. And some of the dust storms were 2 miles high. That means they extended from the ground 2 miles into the air. Imagine seeing a 2-mile high wall of roiling dirt many miles across coming towards you. It had to be terrifying. Instead of just speaking of generalities for the whole decade of drought, let's look at what was considered the worst dust storm of the 1930s. It occurred on April 14, 1935, a date which became known as Black Sunday. It was a colossal dust storm. Estimates are that 300 million tons of fertile topsoil were blown away. Think about that. 300 million tons of topsoil gone. The dust storm from Black Sunday was so huge that it blew dust as far away as Washington, D.C. and New York City. For people on the East Coast that thought the horrendous conditions of the Dust Bowl were being exaggerated, having dirt from Oklahoma, Kansas, and the other Dust Bowl states landing on East Coast cities convinced those people just how bad it was for those struggling farmers on the Southern Plains. Okay, that was the worst black blizzard, but there were many horrible dust storms throughout the decade. Current estimates are that for the total of the 1930s, some 1.2 billion tons of soil was lost from the area known as the Dust Bowl. And yes, that's billion with a B. In 1938, as the drought dragged on for the 8th year, the region of the Dust Bowl was hit with a plague of grasshoppers. I'm not kidding. A plague of grasshoppers eating what few plants were left. This was real Old Testament wrath of God stuff. How much more could these poor people take? And it wasn't just economic problems. Yes, these people were losing everything they had, their farms, their livelihoods, and all their money. But there was also illness. It might not have been a medical term, but the people generally called this malady dust pneumonia. When these giant dust storms rolled across the plains, people would breathe in all the dust and dirt. Even when they were indoors and they covered their mouths with wet cloths, they were still unable to prevent all of this dirt from getting into their lungs. In the 1930s, people did not have sophisticated masks and respirators like we do today. They did the best they could with what they had. And the farmhouses and other buildings existing in that time could not keep the dust and dirt outside. As a result, everybody in the area inhaled a lot of soil blown along in these giant dust clouds. The accumulation of dust and dirt in a person's lungs would make them very ill. They would have difficulty breathing and have excessive coughing. They often developed high fevers. Some people recovered and survived dust pneumonia, but regrettably, many did not. We don't have accurate figures, but it is estimated that approximately 7,000 people, a lot of them children, died in the 1930s from dust pneumonia. The Dust Bowl led to the largest migration in American history. Although they did not want to, many people abandoned their farms. Some had no choice when they lost their farms to foreclosures. In the 1930s, approximately 1/4 of the population of the area we now call the Dust Bowl, those parts of the 5 states I described earlier, moved out of the region. In some counties, the population dropped by as much as 40%. By 1940, 2.5 million people had moved out of the Plains states. Contrary to what you think because of the book and the movie The Grapes of Wrath, not everybody moved to California, but a lot of people did. The population of California in 1930 was less than 5.7 million people. A decade later in 1940, the population was over 6.9 million people. That's an increase of 21%. It's estimated that only approximately 200,000 people who moved to California in the 1930s were from the Plains states. The rest of that over 1.2 million increase in population came from other states and foreign countries as people were seeking better opportunities during the Depression. Of course, a certain percentage of the increase in California's population was due to good old-fashioned natural birth rate. By contrast, Oklahoma's population declined from 2.39 million in 1930 to 2.33 million in 1940. That's a decline of approximately 2.5% of the state population. And if that doesn't sound like much, you have to remember this was a time period when the population throughout the U.S. was greatly increasing. The people from the Plains states were not welcomed in California. As a Californian, I'm ashamed to say that people moving here during the Depression were greatly discouraged from entering the state. Although the people that migrated from the Plains states to California were not all from Oklahoma, they were universally called Okies. When these so-called Okies hit the state line of California, they were told that California's relief rolls were overcrowded and that there was no use coming any further, that there was really nothing good waiting for them in California. There was a while in the 1930s when the Los Angeles Police Department sent police officers to the Arizona border where Route 66 entered California to tell people that they were not wanted in the Golden State. The LAPD would even arrest people who were considered undesirables, meaning that they had no money and no place to go. These people were arrested as vagrants. This practice was exposed by a lawsuit from the American Civil Liberties Union as well as the Los Angeles Times, which questioned the use of city funds to pay for such activities. After approximately 6 weeks, such bad publicity finally led to the end of the LAPD going way out of its jurisdiction to the state line with Arizona. Think about how hard this was for those people who became known as Okies. You packed up as much as you could in your car or your truck. You were not driving on the greatest roads. Maybe you were doing about 35 to 40 miles per hour. And if you ran out of money, you were in big trouble. How were you going to buy gas? These people were mainly staying in tents along the side of the road. A lot of them got sick, some very sick. And a lot of them were sick to begin with. A common reason why they left the Dust Bowl was because one or more family members had dust pneumonia. The main reason that the entire region of the Dust Bowl did not become completely depopulated was because of Franklin Roosevelt. A lot of his advisors were recommending that the government just provide assistance to move these people to better lands. It was a valid argument. The region was not really suited to farming. These advisors wanted to have the entire Dust Bowl depopulated and converted into federal grasslands. But FDR did not want to give up on the approximately 3/4 of the residents that wished to stay in the Southern Plains. So programs were instituted to help these farmers stay on their land. I'll describe those programs in a moment. There were some scientists in the 1930s that thought that the Dust Bowl could have a cumulative effect and destroy better farmland throughout the Midwest. When the giant dust storms occurred, sand and dust were blown into other states. The concern was that this would cause crop failures in those neighboring states. This would have an aggregate consequence of creating a desert in the middle of North America. Was this just being overly alarmist? Maybe, maybe not. For one thing, sections of the United States are already deserts. The effects of the Dust Bowl might merely increase the deserts of the Southwest into the Great Plains. Another argument that was presented for these dire warnings was that thousands of years ago, the area that is now the Sahara Desert was lush and green and supported various types of animals that needed water like giraffes and hippos. Could the Dust Bowl be the start of such a cataclysm in the central part of North America? This is way beyond my expertise. All I know is that some credible scientists believe that it could possibly go that way if the Dust Bowl was left unchecked for long periods of time. Let's put away this Armageddon that might happen in the distant future. During the 1930s, the federal government was trying to end the ecological disaster that was already taking place. So what did they do to alleviate this man-made calamity? One New Deal program that helped people in the Dust Bowl was financial aid to the desperate farmers. This economic assistance consisted of emergency loans, some outright grants, and debt reduction. The loans were often used so tenant farmers could buy the land that they had been working, or for small farmers who owned their land to expand their farms. The money was also used to buy or repair equipment and to buy supplies. One of the largest New Deal projects to save the Dust Bowl was the Shelter Belt Project. As I explained earlier, this is essentially a treeless region which is extremely flat. There's nothing to break up the winds, which blow almost constantly and at times are very strong. President Roosevelt asked his forest chief in 1933 if it would be feasible to plant trees throughout this region to act as a shelter belt to break up the wind. Trees were a great way to reduce wind velocity, as well as to hold the soil together with their roots. And the shade from the trees also lessens the evaporation of moisture from the soil. For several reasons, trees could be a large part of the solution. Now, to be clear, FDR did not invent this idea. Settlers in the 1850s learned that planting groups of trees, sometimes called belts, prevented the wind from blowing away their soil in storms. And starting in 1913, the U.S. Department of Agriculture had been planting trees in a shelter belt program, but that was on a very small scale. The problem was individual farmers could not plant a sufficient number of trees to truly affect the weather conditions, and the existing program from the Department of Agriculture was just too small. This would have to be a new, massive federal project. There was a lot of disagreement as to whether a large-scale tree planting program would be worth the expense, but President Roosevelt insisted on it. FDR wanted the tree planting program for two main reasons. Number one, as I just described, altering the landscape of the Great Plains with trees would help to prevent the Dust Bowl conditions. And number two, the Shelter Belt program would also provide thousands of jobs at a time when unemployment in the United States was almost 25% of the workforce. The program started with $1 million in 1934, and headquarters were established in Lincoln, Nebraska. The first tree of the Shelter Belt program was planted on March 19, 1935, near Magnum, Oklahoma. Trees were planted on the perimeters of farms. By the time the United States entered World War II in 1941, the Shelter Belt Project had planted 217 million trees. That's right, 217 million trees. That enormous number of trees was planted on over 230,000 acres of land surrounding approximately 30,000 farms from Texas all the way to the Canadian border. The Shelter Belt program was an enormous success. It helped protect the land for the farmers at that time and for the future. It provided lots of jobs, and it was also beneficial to wildlife, providing habitat, shelter, and food. The Shelter Belt project helped a great deal, but it was not nearly enough. So what else did the Roosevelt administration do for the starving people in the Dust Bowl who had no means of making a living or even feeding themselves? Another New Deal program which addressed the catastrophe was the Soil Conservation Service. In 1933, the Soil Erosion Service was created. 2 years later, it was expanded and renamed the Soil Conservation Service. This agency was under the control of the Department of Agriculture. The man in charge of the Soil Erosion Service and later Soil Conservation Service was Hugh Bennett. He's often called the father of soil conservation. Hugh Bennett had a science degree from the University of North Carolina with an emphasis in chemistry and geology. Before the Dust Bowl became a reality, in the 1920s, Hugh Bennett was writing about soil erosion. When the Dust Bowl hit in the early 1930s, people finally started to pay attention to what he had to say. This is why he headed the Soil Erosion Service and later the Soil Conservation Service from 1933 until 1951. Under Bennett's supervision, federal experts went to individual farms and taught the farmers soil conservation. But farmers needed to work together. In 1937, FDR wrote to all the governors of all the states and recommended that state legislation be passed to allow for local landowners to form soil conservation districts. The states complied. This situation continues today, where there are almost 3,000 soil conservation districts still in existence. Before the Dust Bowl hit in the 1930s, farmers were just producing more and more wheat because it was the cash crop that grew well in that area. So, what were these changes that the Soil Conservation Service convinced farmers were necessary? I'll outline the main ones. Number one, the use of cover crops. That means planting crops that are used to simply cover the soil and prevent erosion. These are not crops that are intended to be harvested. These cover crops are usually grasses or legumes, such as soybeans, as well as a variety of other beans like pinto, navy, and kidney beans. Number two, crop rotation. This is when crops are changed season by season in a systematic progression. Instead of just planting the main cash crop of wheat in the region, they planted some other crops. A variation of crop rotation is strip farming. Strip farming is where the farmer plants long strips with alternated crops. Instead of large areas with one crop, the different crops are planted along narrow strips. Besides helping replenish the nutrients in the soil, crop rotation also helped manage crop production and prices. Farmers could sign up for federal programs that paid them to plant certain crops. This brings us to number three, leaving certain fields fallow. Farmers were also paid by the federal government to leave some of their acreage fallow. Simply put, that means that some of the farmland was not planted with any seeds. Like crop rotation, this replenishes the nutrients in the soil. And this also controlled surplus production of certain crops. Although the land was fairly flat, there are some hills in the region of the Dust Bowl. So these next two measures were used. The fourth measure implemented by the Soil Conservation Service was terracing. This was a method used on sloping hills. Terracing literally meant making some level terraces in a hill to grow crops. It almost looks like giant steps made in the hill. A fifth measure was contour plowing. Contour plowing is simply the practice of plowing or planting across a slope following its elevation contour lines. In other words, plowing horizontally along the curves of the land. Okay, here's my disclaimer. If I have made any errors in describing these farming practices, I apologize. The only time I've ever been to a farm was in grade school when we went on a class trip. And my only connection to farming is that my father-in-law and one of my close friends grew up on farms. I have no personal knowledge of agriculture and only learned some of it in connection with the history of the Dust Bowl and the New Deal programs which sought to alleviate that disaster. The practices and methods I just described rehabilitated most of the Dust Bowl, but some of the land could just not be turned into practical farms. State governments purchased some of the land and created state parks, such as Lake Murray State Park or Greenleaf State Park in Oklahoma. But the large-scale way to take poor farmland out of cultivation was by the federal government. During the 1930s, New Deal agencies purchased almost 4 million acres and made it into permanent grassland. That is over 6,200 square miles of perennial grassland. To put that into perspective, that is much larger than Connecticut, the state where I was born. That is a lot of permanent grassland. To this day, the Shelter Belt Program and the Soil Conservation Service represent the largest U.S. federal government projects to remedy an environmental hazard. So how did the Dust Bowl end? Well, it was a combination of three factors. The first and most important was the end of the drought. The weather finally cooperated. By 1941, regular rain had returned to the area of the Dust Bowl. Farmers could finally grow crops again. The second factor was the combination of government programs I outlined earlier. These programs reduced the soil erosion and allowed for the return to farming when the rains came back. The third factor was World War II. The New Deal programs did a lot to alleviate the suffering of the American people during the Depression. But what ended the Depression was the Second World War. This put the American economy into overdrive as the U.S. became the arsenal of democracy and produced more of the supplies for war than any country in history. This production also included mass production of food. The market for staple crops like wheat and corn had finally returned. So what about today? The changes in the farming practices I described earlier certainly help to prevent another dust bowl when the droughts return. It's just nature. There will always be periods of drought. But farmers in the Great Plains no longer rely on rain. They now depend on a giant aquifer that extends from Texas to Nebraska. An aquifer is essentially an underground reservoir which can be extracted by wells. This aquifer is called the Ogallala Aquifer. And here are 4 fun facts about the Ogallala Aquifer from Scientific American. Number 1, if spread across the U.S., the amount of water from the aquifer would cover all 50 states with 1.5 feet of water. Number 2, if drained, it would take more than 6,000 years to refill this aquifer naturally. Number 3, more than 90% of the water pumped from the Ogallala Aquifer is used to irrigate crops. And number 4, $20 billion a year in food and fiber depend on the Ogallala Aquifer. The problem is that the Ogallala Aquifer is disappearing. The water is getting used up. This is very bad for the long term. Hopefully, scientists can figure a way to avoid another catastrophe on the Great Plains. And if they do find a solution, let's hope we actually listen. Well, that's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Ratings and likes greatly help with the algorithms that determine the placement of podcasts on particular apps. So if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any podcast app that allows for ratings, please consider giving me a 5-star rating. Also, please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers, anybody you know. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for this podcast. Please check out my website, historyanalyzed.com. You will find links to my other podcast episodes, as well as fun for the whole family, with items like This Day in History, book recommendations, historical sound bites, photos of some of the subjects of certain episodes, and links to supporting historical evidence. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.